This video is entitled Scope, and we'll be going over what is scope. This is for the Project Management for Technology course, and this supplement goes with Chapter 4. I'm Dr. James Reneau, and I'm a professor at Shawnee State University, and I'll be taking you through this material today. In this video, we will cover what is scope. We'll cover the scope management plan. We'll discuss the project scope document, which is developed in an iterative nature, and it's built upon the project charter from the previous phase. We're going to talk about scope creep, which is something you don't want to have happen, but it will inevitably try to happen. And we'll talk about the scope approval as we go through the beginnings of the planning phase. So, what is scope? Well, there are two types of scope, but scope, let's start with, is a formal definition of what makes up the project or product. Makes sense? Scope is the formal definition. Now, there are two types of scope that we need to develop here. We need to develop the scope of the project, of the product, which are the functions, features, abilities, what the product's going to do, what services it's going to create, those types of things. So this product of the scope of the product needs to be one type of scope we have, but we also need to create and understand the scope of the project. What are the things that we're going to need to create to actually manage the project? So that would also be scope of the project manager. What formal definitions and things are we going to create in the process of developing the project? So again, there are two types of scope. There's the product scope that defines what we're actually going to deliver, and then the project scope, which defines how we're going to actually make things happen. Because scope is a wildly and hugely important part of any project, we really should have a plan for how we're going to manage the scope and changes to the scope that we're going to use throughout this project. So the scope management plan needs to include how are we going to define the scope, how are we going to define the two parts of the scope. The scope management plan should also include how are we going to actually create the work breakdown structure, which you'll see. The scope management plan should include how do we validate the deliverables, and again, how do we manage scope changes? Because the scope is the big definition for the project, we need to have some sort of plan for how we're going to manage that scope. How are we going to manage the changes? How are we going to manage the problems that we have as we dive into actually planning and implementing this project? This is one of my favorite terms just because it's fun to say, scope creep. Scope creep is not some creepy person but let's first talk about scope and the fact that scope will change as we plan and execute the project. You know, as we get in, as we start to understand, as we create, as we develop our work breakdown structure, certain areas of the project may grow, certain areas of the project may retract. And, there are always going to be little scope changes. But scope creep describes the changes made to the scope without going through a formal process. The developer says, oh, well, it'd be nice if we did this. And he just adds it to the project. It's not part of the project. That wasn't in our original description of the project. That wasn't in our milestones or our requirements. What's it there for? Well, it's scope creep. Things just get added to projects sometimes. And the problem with that is that when these changes get added, when these features get added, when these new things get added without communicating to all of the other stakeholders and all of the other team members, these changes can impact other parts of the project and can potentially cause conflicts and a lot of problems. So, and a waste of money and time in a lot of cases. So we need to be very careful to control the scope creep and to make sure that when we see it start to happen, we nip it in the bud and bring it out to a formal process. Some of those things that tried to creep in are important and we want them, but we need to take them through the formal change control and scope process. So, what is a scope statement? Well, let's use the definition from our book that we've been using. A scope statement includes all of the components that make up the product or service of the project and the results of the project and the results the project or intends to produce. So it needs to include all of the components, all of the things that make up the product of the service, and all of the results. It sounds easy, but it is not. It's an iterative process starting with the charter. So we start with the description and the requirements and the milestones and all of the things that we identified in the charter. And you think, well, didn't I do this already? Isn't that a scope document? No, it's not detailed enough. We need to go through the scope charter and add detail and iterate through it, multiple revisions to really come up with a full scope statement of what the project is going to contain and what it's not going to contain. If something major is not in the scope statement, remember, it's not really in the project because we didn't discuss it. It's not been approved. It's not part of our project. And the scope statement, once it's been created and once we've developed it and once we know what it all contains, has to be approved by our stakeholders. So the scope statement is an iterative thing. We're going to take the charter, we're going to flesh it out, we're going to make it whole, and we're then going to get it approved by the stakeholders. So, what things do a scope statement typically contain? Well, objectives, and they need to be measurable objectives, a description of the product or of the service that we're going to create with the project. Acceptance criteria, which are important because what actually are going to define when the project is done? What will the sponsor, the stakeholders, the customer be expecting to accept at the end of the project? Key performance indicators. What are key performance indicators? For instance, percent on budget, timelines, those types of things that we're going to hold the project to. What are the deliverables going to be? What are we actually going to give the client, the customer, at the end of the project? Exclusions from scope would be a really good thing to include in a scope statement because these things are very specifically not in the project. Now, they may be version 2, they may be version 3, but it would be nice to list them and say, well, these aren't in our project today, but the next project should contain these things, maybe. That's a good way to exclude them from scope. Time and cost estimates. Now, because we've iterated and spent some more time from the project charter, our time and cost estimates should be getting a little bit more accurate as we have spent more time analyzing and really understanding what the project is. And assumptions that we've brought to the table, that we've brought to the project, also need to be identified and listed and enumerated here in the scope statement. The scope statement also should contain a constraints section. I thought it was so important, I created a whole slide about the constraints section of a scope statement. And what are some of the constraints that our project is going to have? Well, budget, because there's never enough money. I've never, at least, ever been on a project where there was an unlimited amount of money. Scope would be a constraint, and scope constrains scope. That's kind of recursive, but it is because the scope of what we've defined the project to be defines what the scope is. The deliverables are constraints. What do we have? When are we done? The quality can be a constraint. The environment can be a constraint. Resources and lastly, scheduling can be a constraint to the scope of the project because, well, if we want it done in 2 weeks, we can't build the Eiffel Tower in 2 weeks. We may just have to build a doghouse. So you can see how that would be a constraint that would limit that would limit the actual scope of the project. And these are things that always have to be kept in mind as we're creating the scope document and should be included in our scope document at the end. Remember always that your project is not being done in a vacuum. It's being done in a business or a household or an organization of some sort. And there are always things, influences that push on the constraints and push on the project. Changes. For instance, a decision is made, a strategic decision is made a third of the way through a project that we're going to add these new features. Well, that's a great thing. We need to do it. It needs to be part of the project, but it needs to be approved. It needs to be formal. It needs to go through our project scope governance. It needs to go through our teammates. We need to discuss it with stakeholders and the sponsor. And once we understand that it's the right thing to do, we do it so we can change the scope. Scope creep is something that also influences our project because they're unapproved and informal changes that are always pushing against our project. Reprioritization of an organization can influence our project and our scope. Other constraints that we haven't thought of or other projects can be well, actually it's listed down at the bottom, can be an influence on our project. Management can be an influence on our project. For instance, senior managers that aren't our sponsor that could bring influence into our project. The stakeholders could also be influential in the scope and the changes to the scope and the constraints of the scope as we're defining and as we're working with our scope. So these are just some of the influences, and I wanted to list them here just so that we could have a moment to talk about them separately. Lastly, we have got all of this put together. We understand how we're going to manage our scope with a scope management document. We've identified the scope of the project and of the product and of the management of the project. Now that we've done all of this, we need to communicate it with the shareholders. We need to communicate it again with the sponsor, the stakeholders, the project team, and we need to get a formal okay. This is kind of the project charter, kind of blown up into a lot more detail about the project and how we're going to actually do it, what's in, what's out. And so we need approval at this point as we start to then move into the next part of planning, which is the work breakdown structure. Two works are referenced in the creation of this this video presentation. From Reich, the definition of what is scope, and then Kim Heldman's CompTIA Project Plus Study Guide, and the references are above. This presentation is copyright 2020 by James Reneau Ph.D. You can contact me at jreneau@shawnee.edu. This work is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, Share-alike 4.0 International License, and I would like to say thank you for watching.